I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a downpour of topics pertaining to modern music, including, but not limited to, artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Today on Velocities in Music, Tom and I are spoiling ourselves with an artist deep dive into one of our collective favorite bands, the Britpop Legends, Blur.
Woo!
Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest episode sent to your device for your listening pleasure, or leisure, for that matter.
Oh, yeah, for your leisure.
Ah, yeah, I like it. Also, Velocities in Music doesn't want your money. We also don't want to introduce any ads into this podcast quite yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities in Music with family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion Tom and I attempt to create in each episode. Tom, you grew up listening to Blur.
I did.
You grew up listening to Blur, and because you're just a damn good friend.
Well, thanks.
I
don't know where you're going with this.
You just like strapped me. This is going to go bad places quick, but you forced me to listen to Blur, maybe sometimes even against my will.
Probably.
Over the years, especially like when we were in college. I remember playing cribbage at your house when we would either be like over lunch or skipping a class or something like that, which we did from time to time.
Sometimes, yeah, cribbage is more important.
Yeah, cribbage and music. I mean, there's a lot of appeal there.
Definitely.
And I remember one of those bands that you showed me was Blur. And now, like most Americans, I was way more familiar with Gorillaz than I was Blur. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But I could tell that there was something special there. And then over the course of VIMTV, through the first few years we were doing that, we did some throwback albums, and we covered a couple Blur albums. We covered Modern Life is Rubbish. We covered Parklife. We covered Self-Titled. And you know, when you look into some of Blur's discography, especially the more well-known albums, it's pretty hard to listen to those with a critical eye and not say, wow, there's something special going on here. But I'd be curious to hear your story. How did you get into Blur?
Sure. I got into Blur probably 1997, right after Self-Titled came out. I mean, you know, and we'll get to that point in their discography in a bit here. But that was the album that really helped them break through into the American mainstream with the lead single Song 2, right? It was a catchy track, and it just fit with the American market at the time. From there, you know, my brothers had picked up Modern Life is Rubbish and Parklife, so I had those three albums that I kind of grew up with from around the time that I was 8, and I just loved. Now, while they are, you know, my favorite band, we're going to be talking about them as my favorite band.
They are your favorite band.
They are my favorite band.
Officially.
Yes, but I want to put this disclaimer out there. It hasn't always been that way. I've been listening to them since I was a kid. But really, I only grew up with those three albums. And if you had asked me probably up till about 2009, 2010, who my favorite band was, I would have told you Metallica. Where I ended up giving Blur the edge in that battle of the bands within my head is right around 2009, 2010 when I was in college. And I was going through a big musical exploration.
Yeah.
Music was much more accessible, easy to get hold of, that is. And I thought to myself, I'm like, you know what? I've always loved Modern Life is Rubbish, Parklife, and Self-Titled. Why haven't I dived in to the other Blur albums?
Right.
So I picked up 13, I picked up Think Tank, Great Escape, and Leisure, and I absolutely fell in love, not as much with Leisure, but with the other three. And I realized, I'm like, holy shit, these are pretty much just as good as the ones that I grew up with.
Right.
Why have I not gotten into these? And at that point, the obsession took hold. And they
beat out Metallica.
They ended up beating out Metallica.
Now, in your mind, was it like Damon Albarn was arm wrestling James Hetfield?
That'd be a sight to see, wouldn't it?
I think James would win.
Probably. No, it wasn't. It was one of those realizations that kind of just slowly took over me. That I'm like, you know what? When I really look at their entire discographies, Blur doesn't have as many questionable weak spots to me. There's more variety in their sound, and that's kind of what it came down to. I was like, there's a special place in my heart for this band.
Yeah, and Metallica's 3 deep dive podcasts that we put out at the end of 2016. We covered several just flat out weak Metallica albums, especially like some of their later 90s work. early 2000s work, and Blur really doesn't have those blemishes.
No.
We need to jump into some history here, but I wouldn't call any single Blur album a bad album.
No,
in fact,
agree.
I think they're all good to some extent, varying degrees of good and great.
Sure.
So history.
Sure.
Where does this band come from?
Well, they come from various parts of Great Britain, but they ended up meeting at Goldsmith College in London in the late 80s when they were kids. Just teenagers at the time, really started playing in some bands. The four of them, I'll go through their names real quick. Damon Albarn is the singer, kind of main songwriter. Not that the others don't have input as well, but he comes up with a lot of the foundations of some of the songs.
Yeah, commonly referred to as the front man.
The front man, for sure. Graham Coxon as the guitar player, Alex James as the bass player, and Dave Rowntree is the drummer. And they all were playing in different incarnations of bands around London at the time. And they ended up settling on that after, various guitar players and bass players would come and go. Those four really seemed to click. But that they started writing songs. They started playing a lot of shows. They went on a short tour with the Cramps in like 1990, working on songs and kind of just nailing down their art, their craft, and ended up getting signed to Food Records at really pretty early on in their career. I mean, early on in their lives. They were like 19, 20 years old or something like that. And they first recorded the single She's So High, which would end up being on their first album, Leisure, which we'll be getting into in a moment. But at that point, that's when it caught the attention of producer Stephen Street, who we know from producing the Smiths. So he caught wind of that, wanted to work with the band, ended up working with them didn't produce all the tracks on Leisure, but I want to say like 7 of the 12 around there, a little over half. And started a relationship with them there. And so that's really, the brief history. And the important thing about the briefness of the history, of course, there's more little details to get into, but I don't feel like they're all that important. Really, the key is they actually got signed pretty quickly. And the reason that is important is because they hadn't really quite fully discovered themselves yet as artists. They had a lot of songs they were kicking around that they had played live, that they were still kind of working on. So this kind of launched them into full blast where they had to finish these songs, they had to record them, they had to release an album. And it's almost was a little bit premature. And I think that's why Leisure turned out the way it did, not sounding as much of a fully crafted album, but sounding more like a collection of songs. And I think that's where we start with it.
So Leisure came out in 1991. And as the band's first album, how would you describe their initial sound as presented on Leisure?
Their initial sound, well, there were a lot of kind of fun genre labels being thrown around in Britain at the time. There was Madchester, there was Baggy, and these genres, to me...
Those sound very British.
Right. To me, what those genres really embody is it's rock, but there's a dance element to it.
Yeah.
There's a focus on rhythm and these upbeat kind of moods and tempos. You hear that from bands of the time like Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses.
Right.
Even, getting a little dancier in electronica. You had like Primal Scream, stuff like that. There's a resurgence of bands like that even today with bands like Kasabian and there are plenty that have that kind of sound. But they started in that kind of mode. I think that was seen as maybe kind of a fad at the time. Leisure received somewhat lukewarm response from critics, but people still really enjoyed it. It actually performed and charted pretty decently for a debut album. I was just watching the documentary No Distance Left to Run, Jake, in preparation for this. And I think it was Damon. One of them said, I'm glad that we made our debut when we did, because it was back in the time where you could kind of put out a album, kind of a mediocre album, and not just get ruined for it.
And it's interesting that even like Damon Albarn thinks that this is a mediocre album, because I would say it's probably better than that. Now I have not historically spent a ton of time with Leisure. I'd listened
Yeah.
to it a couple times before this, enough that I was familiar with the sound, but then going through preparation for this podcast, really gave this like several really detailed listen, took some notes over it. And I gotta say, like, the things that I noticed about this album is one, the songwriting is pretty aggressive. This is rock music that they're going for here. They really wanted to create an album that had an edge, and I think that that's important when you start to focus on the next couple of albums that come out, which really define Blur as the Britpop legends that they became. This album has more of that rock edge. You hear the guitars really working, some bigger choruses, still simple choruses but loud. With you have a lot of distortion on the guitar, and I also hear a ton of shoegaze influence as well.
Hugely.
And you can really hear that in the washiness of the production and the choruses and these extended bridges that you would hear in most of these tracks. Now, I like a number of these tracks, but tracks like Slow Down, track 3, has that distorted bass and guitar, one of the main shoegaze tracks.
I've always said it'll never change. All you have to do, just you be you. That's all I want to say.
Tracks like Bad Day and then later on in the album Come Together, which is, again, faster paced. It has those shoegazy guitars.
You should have known I'd do anything for you. So why don't we come together?
To me, these songs are almost formulaic.
Yeah.
Almost a little too basic. It's very verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, that kind of pop structure. I love the dynamics that Blur is able to put into this, but the songs get a little bit predictable no matter how well you perform instrumentally, how the artist performs their instruments. That repetition does get tiring. And it's also, I think it's not just in the instrumentation. You also hear it in the lyrical content as well, in the vocal parts. It's especially in the choruses. It's one line repeated, 4 or 5 times in a row.
I actually think the weakest aspect of this album is Damon Albarn.
Yes, I agree with that.
I think that Alex and Dave and Graham on the guitar, bass, and drums, not respectively, I did those in different orders, but I think that they lock in well. Now, you're absolutely right that the structures of the songs are predictable. They're somewhat repetitive, except maybe on track 6, Sing. I think that's a really cool kind of slow building track.
Yeah, Sing, and then track 11, Birthday, which has a little bit slower, has this Pink Floyd vibe, and then it has like this wall of sound of guitars that come in.
So small.
I would agree that those are definitely highlights where they're
Those
doing
are the
something a
tracks
little
that
different.
broke from the formula,
Right.
which is why they stand out so much. Is because every other track sounds alike.
Right. But right from the get-go on their debut, you hear the instrumentalists in the band just working their asses off.
Yeah.
Especially Graham on the guitar. I mean, even for a young band, the guitar line to There's No Other Way is a great, just smooth, slick, British rock guitar line, and I absolutely love it. But then a lot of Damon's vocal performances, they don't feel inspired. They're kind of droll. The lyrics are very just shallow.
Yeah.
There's not much to say about them.
Yeah, I think that you can really pin it down to there just wasn't a lot of ideas and great composition in the vocal parts themselves.
Yeah, the melodies were kind of uninteresting.
Yeah, it's not that Damon didn't perform them well enough. I mean, yes, he was a little bit younger. His voice wasn't quite as mature as it is on the later records, where I really feel like he is like a major contributor to the sound. Just besides the lyrics, obviously, but you're right. Like, just the vocal parts themselves and the lyrics aren't enough to really impress you.
Yeah. So you get more won over by the sound and the attitude and the instrumentals than anything. And Damon does a good enough job sitting on top of that. It got them enough attention to keep going and make another record and everything. But that's kind of where it ended up. So
One thing I'd like to point out with this record that I think, Blur has toyed with this, especially in the early years, which is what we're covering in this podcast, the first 4 records, is the harmonies in the vocals. They do a lot with harmonies, and that's something that I hadn't really picked up on before, but I certainly have like a major appreciation for, because it's tough to do, and I think it makes the vocals sound a little bit thicker, and it made the chorus repetition so much more impactful and maybe noticeable. Maybe that's a double-edged sword. I'm not quite sure. But I mean, they were clearly aware of what they were doing. They even called the song on here Repetition.
Yeah.
So like it's a theme of the album that they were consciously aware of. This is the sound that we're going for. But these sound like songs that they had played live and kicked around live, gotten some good feedback on.
Yeah.
And then they just brought into the studio and put on an album.
Mm-hmm. And actually, Graham does a lot of those backup vocals, and I think he does a great job. I think his voice complements Damon's really well. If you listen closely, once you get to know what Graham's voice sounds like, you can hear it in the background in a lot of those parts. And I think that was a wise choice rather than just having Damon double track a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, they still did some of the time to some degree, but getting the multiple vocalists in there is a big part of it. So we're in 1991. Leisure is released. It's received pretty well, but it was a very tightly label-controlled debut. They wanted to make money off it. They wanted it to be a commercial success. And at that point, I think that Blur was happy enough with that. After this, they had a very kind of life-changing experience where, first off, they were badly in debt because they were being mismanaged. They booted their old manager, got a new manager, and basically what it came down to is he said, look, in order to get yourself out of this debt and move forward, you really should go on this extended tour of the U.S., where Leisure was decently received but not overly popular. So they went on this like 40-plus date tour of the U.S., and it almost tore them apart, really. They were fighting all the time. They were drinking all the time. They hated American culture because, keep in mind, this is 1991. This is when grunge just hit the mainstream, and Blur was not grunge at all.
They were
they're
so far from
right.
it.
They're coming over at a very precarious time in American music culture. And so they just found all these things that they hated. They were disgusted by the whole grunge movement. And then but really, instead of letting it destroy them, which I think it almost did, they took that and they turned it into something that they could rebel against. And they said, you know what? Let's go back to Britain and make the most British album that we possibly can. And really, Damon was trying to create in advance the foundation of the Britpop and British rock revival and movement of the 90s, because he thought this American music is crap. So if we want to see a change in music culture, we got to be the change. Mm-hmm. And so they set out to create Modern Life is Rubbish. Between these two albums, they had a single called Pop Scene, which actually was included in the American version of Modern Life is Rubbish. But the song didn't go over all that well in Great Britain, so they decided to leave it off the British version of the album and just focus on this kind of new sound. And I think that they found new inspiration. And I think that's one of the reasons that this album turned out as good as it did. You know, coming off of such a formulaic, label-controlled album like Leisure, Modern Life is Rubbish really kicks up the artistry and also just gives their music much more of a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, this is 1993, so they've had 2 years to kind of think of songs and record songs before they released Modern Life is Rubbish. And the artistry, as it improves, it may be kind of concurrently with the complexity that they're putting into the songwriting. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think makes this album so much more appealing to at least me and my preference, is because it's just overflowing with ideas. And you hear that from the first track, For Tomorrow, when it just comes in with, Damon Albarn belting out, he's a 20th century boy.
Mm-hmm.
He's a 20th century boy with his hands on the round.
And then just the choruses are all turned way up in both the creativity and the hooks. It just becomes this infectious, poppy, swirling effect that you just can't get these songs out of your head when you listen to them. The beginning of this album really, really just hits me right in the chest. Where you have For Tomorrow, which I was just talking about, but then Advert, which is a wonderful song, started introducing some samples, and you have a more upbeat, faster pace tempo, which I think Leisure was lacking a bit.
I need something to remind me that there's something else. You need a holiday somewhere in the sun.
Colin Zeal, Pressure on Julian, very, very heavy, almost a little bit of that grunge influence in the guitars.
And kind of the shoegaze brought back from Leisure and the effects on the guitars. This album, to me, I mean, I'm going to be gushing over this band a lot through the course of this podcast. To me, of Blur's 8 albums, 4 of them to me are like masterpiece level, and that's why I love the band so much. And this is one of them. And I know that I'm in the minority on that. I think that this album is. I don't think there's anyone out there who likes Blur and maybe just hates this album. I'm sure there are a few, but I think that it gets a little bit overlooked. For me, the reason I love it so much is because I put this in the same category of albums we've talked about in the past, Jake, like The Smiths' The Queen is Dead and Pixies' Doolittle, where they are melding so many different styles of rock together.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense, but somehow through Stephen Street's consistency in production, just the consistency of their performance quality and the way that they gel as a band, it makes sense. You have Advert, which is really kind of a thrashy punk rock song, but with full-bodied major chords driving it. And then you have, Blue Jeans, which is more of a ballad. You have Chemical World, which is a little bit more psychedelic. A little later, you have tracks like Sunday Sunday and Villa Rosie, which are a little bit more of a fanfare-esque kind of like vaudeville feel.
Dream of protein on a plate, regret you left me quite so late. Gather the family round the table to eat enough to sleep. Oh, the Sunday sleep.
There's just such a combination. You get a little bit more experimentation too, like Intermission, which comes between Chemical World and Sunday Sunday. This fast moving piano thing that just evolves into just noise as the tempo progresses. I just love all of that adventurous spirit that they show on this record.
One of my favorite tracks, and I remember falling in love with this track when we reviewed this album way back in like 2011, 2012. But it's Oily Water, track 10. It has a lot of delay on the vocals, some very shoegazy guitars, just really solid guitar presentation overall. And while it has that shoegazy effect to it, the songwriting is so much more experimental than anything that you heard on Leisure. Now, if I have to give some criticisms to Modern Life, because I know you're just going to gush over it.
Yeah. Bounce me out here, man.
Well, what I would say is this album is a huge step forward from a really decent debut in Leisure, or Leisure, however we Americans choose to say it wrong. While it's a huge step forward, I don't feel that this is Blur perfected yet. This really isn't. This is the first step into this like Britpop avant-garde, going to just throw out this lightly conceptual album about modern life and make the most British album ever. The other thing is that they don't break completely away from the Leisure formula of the verse chorus with shoegaze influence. There are tracks in here, Tom, one of them that you mentioned, track 7, Chemical World, and several of the tracks on the last third of the record, I feel like, don't really break away enough and establish enough of an identity separate that really makes this the album. And I think that for that reason, I rank it just slightly under where you would.
I see what you mean.
But like one of the things that I discovered is that almost every single Blur album, in fact, maybe every Blur album, is front heavy. And I think that that's just a preference of the band, is that they organize the songs in accordance to the ones that they feel strongest. I'm just speculating here. I don't actually know if this is true. But like the front half of this album, I think you'd be hard pressed to come up with an argument that says the back half is stronger than the front half.
I think you're absolutely right. I think by the time you get to the end, songs like Coping and Turn It Up, while I still really like them, they're not quite as strong, and they accomplish something similar. Also, I think that's a fair criticism because Blur albums tend to run a little long. This album is like 56 minutes or something. And in fact, the American version is even longer because it has Pop Scene. At the end, it has 2 hidden tracks with Peach and When the Cows Come Home. That's the version that I grew up with, as having it on CD.
Right.
It also had an alternative mix of Chemical World, and a different version of Chemical World, which I actually liked better than the British version. And maybe that's just for sentimental reasons.
You're very ethnocentric,
right? nothing too objective to state about that. But also, I do have to say, while I think this is such a smooth album, I put it on in front to back. I don't feel like there's a spot I want to skip. It also doesn't really have as many highlights. One highlight for me is Miss America. I think that's a really cool kind of flurried. You have these like chimes that are just going in this mess the whole time, and this auxiliary percussion and kind of reverbed out guitar. It's kind of this weird, murky, but also very sweet song.
I don't mind at all. I love only you.
That's a highlight for me, but like if I was making a list of my top 10, even maybe 20 Blur songs, I don't know if much of anything from this album would show up, but I just love putting it on, and the energy that it has, the attention to detail. There's so many auxiliary percussion pieces. There are so many great vocal layers in here.
The samples and sound effects that they add really give this a wider sonic breadth than what we've heard previously.
Also early on, and I mean, Graham Coxon was doing this in their debut, but even more on Modern Life is Rubbish. The guy had a great ear for guitar effects. Especially like on Oily Water you were talking about, where there's that modulator on the guitar in the beginning. These things are really key to shaping the sounds of the songs, and I think they had a really good knack for it. But also, we talked about this a little bit, but to expand a little bit more, Damon Albarn just upped his lyrical game. This is the start of what, in hindsight, they didn't intend to do this, but in hindsight has been called Blur's life trilogy of albums. Modern Life is Rubbish, Parklife, and The Great Escape. And this is where Damon started, in his effort to almost endorse British lifestyle and culture. He started writing these third-person perspective songs where he's, almost seeing life through the eyes and witnessing the lives of these other British people and telling these stories. And I think it's a really interesting way of doing things. It harkens back to bands like the Beatles and the Kinks and these classic British bands that back in the 60s and 70s, when British music was really taking over with the British invasion, were all the rave.
So as we said earlier, Modern Life is Rubbish came out in 1993 and was really the start of the Life series, and they flipped around and came back with their next album, Parklife, in 1994. That is an incredibly short time.
It's a quick turnaround
between albums. And what's, I think, most interesting as now we shift our focus to Parklife, Blur's third record, is how much more advanced these guys were able to get between that 1 year of separation between Modern Life is Rubbish and Parklife. And I really do. A lot of people, I think, put Modern Life is Rubbish and Parklife kind of in the same boat. But I think if you look at the 3 Life albums, Modern Life is Rubbish, Parklife, and The Great Escape, you hear very different takes on the world. It's almost like the way I look at it, Tom, is Parklife is like the first main movie. The Great Escape is the sequel, and Modern Life is the prequel. Like that's how I really view this. So
that makes sense.
And I think Parklife for me is the highlight of Blur's early albums, of this first podcast that we're doing covering their first 4 records, this to me is a masterpiece.
Yeah, I agree.
From the moment that this opens with the track Girls and Boys, I am just taken aback by how aggressively poppy this is.
Yeah.
And for a band to be able to rock as hard as Blur does at times, yet still be and present their sound in such a poppy manner that it really doesn't feel threatening. It really doesn't feel like too anxious, like a lot of rock music tends to try to do. It's somehow, it's like comfort food rock music.
Yeah.
And I love that they're able to do that. You also hear on Parklife them starting to dabble with a lot more of electronic elements and synthesizers, and you hear that right away on Girls and Boys with some of the electronic tinges going on in the background.
On sunny beaches, take your chances. Looking for girls who are boys, who like boys, who pick girls, who do boys.
Yeah, the electronic, not even just the synths, but just the production style. Right. There's this electronic sheen that coats this entire album and makes it sound just immaculate. You know, I mentioned the attention to detail in the layers and the composition on Modern Life is Rubbish, and here they even step it up a notch just with every little production technique, every little thing, even just like track 2, Tracy Jacks, when the guitar comes in and you have the da-da-dun, but it's split, like it only comes in on one speaker and then the last chord comes in on the other speaker. It's a great effect, and I'm hyper focusing on one just tiny detail of that song because that's
song,
all over the place.
Every song on this album is just littered in detail like that, and that's what makes this album so special. Is that the songwriting is incredibly. I won't go as far to say experimental. I would classify certain tracks on this record as more experimental than experimental as far as Blur is concerned and where their music is at this point. But just expansive. These songs cover so much ground in so little time. And what I really love and what makes me know that this is a masterpiece record is that you can take any one of these tracks on Parklife, look at them individually and go, wow, that's a masterpiece track. You put them all together and they sound incredible as an album as well. Maybe even more powerful because the sum is greater than the...
It really is, because there's so much variety.
Absolutely.
This is an album that one of them said, it doesn't really it sounds like a mess on paper, but then you listen to it and you're like, oh yeah, this is great. Like it doesn't make any sense for this to sound as good as it is. And a lot of times it sounds like they're taking carnival music and working it into pop songs. You have the Debt Collector, which is this waltzy instrumental track, kind of focused around like Graham's saxophone. And then that goes into the trippy Far Out, which bassist Alex James actually sings. Just this psychedelic little song about the stars, where he's naming off a bunch of stars and celestial bodies.
I spy in the night sky, don't I?
What album has room for those 2 tracks in a row? And yet somehow it helps glue it together, whereas you would think that it would actually disconnect the album. It just works somehow. But I think also this is where they start to have the tact to make their more sentimental moments even more powerful. They know how to craft that. You know, we had some of that on Modern Life is Rubbish. I mentioned Miss America. Also, Blue Jeans is a great kind of ballad track, but it's still kind of a full band track. Here, there is End of a Century, which is a really great sentimental kind of full band song.
That is my favorite Blur song.
I don't blame you. It's
and
a great
one of my favorite songs of all time.
You're looking so healthy. We all say don't want to be alone. We wear the same clothes 'cause we feel the same. And kiss the dry lips when we say goodnight.
It's a brilliant track, and what they accomplish on that track in under 3 minutes is really amazing. Later on, you have To the End, This Is a Low, Clover Over Dover. These are all a little bit more sentimental songs, but they know just how to make them potent.
Yeah, To the End is an interesting one to pick on a little bit because it's one of my track picks on this record. I think the line, well, you and I collapsed in love, and the chorus line of and it looks like we're going to make it.
Well, you and I collapsed in love, and it looks like we might have made it.
That it's almost poetic in a way, but the way that Damon Albarn sings that line is almost anthemic. And I think that this is really where we start to see, and this is going to become more pertinent in subsequent records, is like Blur really kind of shifted from these like aggressive rock ditties to more anthemic songs.
Yeah.
And you start to hear some of that come out on Parklife, and it's a neat step for the band, because if you have anthems, you have your rock songs, and you have your ballads. That gives you more diverse just like song types to go to, and you can just make a much more fluid album listening experience because you have more tricks in your bag of tricks.
Yeah. With Modern
That's
Life...
a terrible metaphor. I'm never using that again.
That's all right.
Tricks in your bag of tricks.
In your bag of... Oh, tricks.
I need I need a little bunny.
Yeah.
Tricks bunny.
Oh, God. If Modern Life is rubbish is kind of hearkening back to the Beatles and the Kinks, I feel like Parklife is taking you into the late 70s new wave movement of bands
That's
like
a very good point.
XTC, even like Elvis Costello, where the guitar sound was having more of that. I mean, you listen to London Loves and Trouble in the Message Center, and the guitar is so sharp. Graham Coxon's tone is so tight that it almost sounds digitized at times.
Yeah.
A melody has taken him over. Coughing in his Japanese motor. The lights of magic.
And of course, that layering with the synths and everything just makes for a really singular experience.
I also think Damon Albarn does a fantastic job with the lyrics on Parklife. They're simply fantastic. They add just this sense of intrigue that draws your ears into the music, and because he's pulling you in with really just very, very exquisitely well written vocal parts and performances, and then also couple that with just exceptionally intriguing lyrics, it pulls your brain and your ears down into all of the songwriting that's going on, and you hear all of those little immaculate details that we were describing earlier. So this album really is kind of the perfect storm of being able to pull you into just another sonic world, and the stories that it tells is really what makes, I think, this to be such a special listen, and I think rightly so has gone down in history as Blur's best album.
And I think it will continue to, which is, I don't disagree with. It's not my favorite of theirs, but I still don't disagree with the acclaim that it's gotten. But from a certain standpoint, it actually surprises me, simply because this album, like if you played it for me and I didn't know anything about the historical context or success of it, I'd be like, well, I assume that this album was a complete commercial failure because it's so damn weird. And it's so out there and it's so all over the place. But somehow that ended up being the thing that allowed people to get behind it. In fact, the record executive, when they handed it into him and he listened to it, he didn't like it at all. He didn't think that it would do well.
They're probably too complex.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, this is kind of a side note, but I think, in my opinion, from watching videos and documentaries about them, from reading about them, I feel like probably a lot of the reason they weren't more successful in America was due to their management. Now, obviously, they tried to be a particularly British band, so of course that's not really designed to appeal to other cultures. But at the same time, like I feel like from what I've read, their label never fully had their back because Blur was always making these unpredictable, unprecedented moves. From Leisure to Modern Life, it was a huge change. From Modern Life to Parklife, it was a huge change.
Yeah.
And while the band, I think, was smart enough to be able to see the future music where it was going and actually help determine it, I don't think that the label from a business perspective got behind it.
They also put so much pressure on the band to release the album so quickly. You have Modern Life
Yeah.
in 93, you have Parklife in 94, and then The Great Escape comes out in 95. They wrote these albums back to back to back. It's incredible that you hear so much sonic separation between the albums.
Right.
Yet still, it makes perfect sense why these albums are all so kind of similar in a way, or at least building off of the same sonic tropes that you hear in each of the records. It's not really surprising that this didn't take off in America when you think about the type of music that was really, really popular in the
Right.
U.S. at that time.
Yeah, 1994. It's now you got Weezer, you got Soundgarden, you got a lot of guitar heavy bands.
The Downward Spiral.
Downward Spiral came. Yeah, 1994 was great, right? And Parklife is part of that, but just on the other side of the ocean from where we were at the time. And as Americans, those worlds hadn't quite converged yet. But Blur saw a lot of success with this album. It went to number 1. And they also won a lot of awards for it. Now, this is also the year that Oasis's debut album, Definitely Maybe, came out. And I don't want to focus too much on the whole battle of Britpop rivalry thing, but it did end up affecting them quite a bit from
Especially Damon.
Yeah, from late 1994 and up through even, like 1997. They won a lot of awards for this. They started this kind of feud with Oasis, who, Oasis aren't the Gallagher brothers aren't necessarily known for their accommodating personalities
Or their good music either.
in some circles, yes. But we're moving on. We're moving on from 1994 and Parklife, and we're moving on to The Great Escape.
Now, why didn't they name this something with life in it?
They thought about it.
Yeah.
They were trying to come up with ideas to work in the word life, and I guess they just didn't come up with anything that they liked.
But The Great Escape kind of, and the album cover I think plays into this as well, where you see some young people, relatively wealthy looking people on like a speedboat of some kind, with blue skies jumping into blue water. And then actually the LP that Tom was kind enough to loan me his box set, so I could listen to this album, listen to all these albums on vinyl. And the LP is really sweet because it has a picture of a shark on it. So it's like, oh, you're diving into the water, and then you put it on and the shark's there. I like that.
And I think that's actually goes to show there's something deeper about this album. I don't think they fully succeeded with this one. I wouldn't call this one of their masterpiece albums, Great Escape.
I do think it's very underrated.
I agree. I think it's very good. But this is where also, in this whole Life trilogy of albums, The Great Escape is more about disenchantment with that middle class urban life. As you said, the covers is someone diving away from this boat, and a lot of the stories told in this album of these characters that Damon is creating is with people who are disillusioned with their lives, disillusioned with their marriage, with their job. We even saw it on Tracy Jacks and Parklife. It
Tri-State Jazz.
Tri-State Jazz, not Tracy Jacks.
Yeah.
That's right. And we even have Damon Albarn picking on himself with the track Dan Abnormal, which is an anagram of Damon Albarn. So we're starting to see him get a little bit autobiographical, but he's still projecting it on other characters.
Immediately, from the start of the record, you hear the lyrical tone change from that playful and cheerfulness that you hear with a little bit of grit to it on Parklife and Modern Life. To just kind of biting and sardonic lyrics, but all the wit is there and it's as sharp as ever. And that's what I think is so great about this record. I also think that Stereotypes, the opening track, is just one of my favorite Blur tracks.
Yeah.
I think it's just one of the strongest. It rocks out, has a great chorus, just an all around great way to open this.
The stereotypes, there must be more to life. All your life you're dreaming, and then you start dreaming. From time to time you should be going on.
So this album, I agree that it's underrated on the whole. I still really like it. But I'm going to be a Debbie Downer for a moment and just call out a few reasons that I don't think this is quite on par with the two albums that came before it, nor really, for me, most of the stuff that came after it. While I think that the core of the songwriting a lot of the times is there, this is a pretty long album once again, and this is the first Blur album where I would say cut a couple tracks. And for me, I can even tell you which ones those are. I would cut out track 5, Fade Away, and track 6, Top Man. I don't think they add a lot. I like Fade Away better than Top Man, but Top Man just doesn't, it's restated in other songs where it's done better. I actually find that song to be a little bit obnoxious. But overall, there are a lot of good highlights on here. You mentioned Stereotypes is a great one. Country House, I think, is great. Charmless Man.
The Universal.
Great guitar work. Universal with the string section, that's a pretty powerful song.
How we like to sing along, though the words are wrong. It really, really, really could happen. Yes, it really, really, really could happen.
But where I think they fall short a little bit on the album as a whole, aside from just the couple tracks I called out that I'm not too keen on, is this album is just super saturated. Every single track has so much going on. When you pay attention to the mix, there's auxiliary percussion, there's additional synth lines, there's guitar flourishes.
It's kind of like Blur's and Justice for All.
What you mean? Where you feel like the production ruins it or something?
No, it's just they're just trying to do too much, and
they are. I think that the sound is almost just too dense, and sometimes it comes off as a little bit messy. Now, what carries it through is just the fact that the songs are really good, but there's so much unnecessary stuff. Like I mentioned, Top Man. There's a verse where you get this like kind of like Eastern flute sounding thing come in, and it's like, is that really necessary? Is every little touch necessary? I think where this album succeeds the most are the songs that are just more straightforward rockers, especially near the end of the album. You get Globe Alone, which is just a really great fast-paced track. I feel like that's where Arctic Monkeys pull a lot of their style from.
Punk influence in that track.
And then Entertain Me, with just a terrifically moving bass line. Those tracks are a little bit more straightforward, not necessarily in songwriting, but just in production and arrangement, and I really appreciate those moments.
It seems like, and it's interesting, because this is an album that, Tom, you haven't historically forced me to listen to. This is one I kind of gravitated to on my own, just out of my own innate curiosity. I remember when we started preparing for Metallica, I was really into this album last fall. And so, like, I think we've kind of organically come to slightly different conclusions on it, because I agree with you. I mean, I think this thing is 56 minutes long, and it feels long. Like, it feels long when you're listening to it. But I have trouble with this one. In later albums, I'll pick out tracks that I think that they could have cut. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Every single Blur album is front heavy. In my opinion, every single one, including the Magic Whip, which came out in 2015. I think every Blur album, it's just the innate way that this band chooses to order their songs. They always include, like, their best songs are on the front half to 2/3 of the record, and that I think is true here. I actually really like track 5, Fade Away. It almost like I almost find myself asking, like, is this ska? I really like the horns. I like the energy there. Top Man, it's upbeat. I really like the chorus. And I think that you need that upbeatness before you go into the Universal.
That's fair.
Now, I think that there are some songs here that, like, it's really hard. I think a lot of the songs just simply accomplish the same thing, but they do it so darn well that you can't help but love each track individually. It's just when you put them all together that maybe it's weaker than just the songs on like an individual basis, because they dilute themselves. We've accused Spoon of doing this album to album, and Blur's doing it within their own album here. But you can also, the other thing I notice about this record that I kind of like about it is the band is clearly, like, even though they released these 3 Life albums so close together, they're clearly starting to kick against their own sound.
Yeah.
And that's what I kind of love about Blur, is that they're always looking to improve, even if like the albums aren't super different from album to album. You can hear how they're adjusting their sound to push it forward. And on this album, you hear the continued use of the electronic effects that you heard on Parklife, but you also hear them turn up the volume a little bit on the guitars. The guitars sound grittier. They're heading more into, like, you can tell that grunge has kind of through osmosis permeated the band's psyche, and they're starting to infuse some of this into their music. So I really like that, and I can't really pick out certain tracks that I'd want to cut, but I do agree that this is probably a slight step down from the previous 2 records.
Yeah. I think for me too, part of the reason that maybe I see this as a little bit of a step down is because it's really the only move in Blur's career that feels logical. Like this is a logical progression from Parklife. It's not necessarily an evolution in the sound and quality, but just you listen to this after Parklife and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas every single other album feels like a complete shift. And that's one thing I love about them. This is the one time where I feel like a little bit stylistically, they're kind of restating themselves, but still, the reason this album holds up is just because the songs are damn good. It's as simple as that.
Now, it got pretty overlooked in the British charts, right?
Well, it actually still was number 1.
Oh, it did.
Yeah, starting with Parklife, every single album that they put out ended up being number 1. In Britain. I got to put that disclaimer on there, number 1 in Britain. But and this will kind of evolve into the beginning of our next podcast, Jake, when we cover the second half of Blur's discography. But this is also where, the feud with Oasis, I think, started to take its toll more so than they would have anticipated, because what happened is Blur's single Country House was released on the same day as Oasis's single Roll With It from the album What's the Story, Morning Glory. And so there's this big feud of who's going to win, who's going to sell more. And in that battle, Blur ended up winning. Country House ended up beating out Roll With It, which I actually think is kind of funny in retrospect because, Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory went on to be a much more acclaimed album than The Great Escape was as an album.
Don't understand that at all.
Which I do understand that. I do because I think that's a great record. But so a lot of people were saying like Blur won the singles battle, but they lost the album war.
Yeah, I can see that.
Which I think is fair, but also you're taking Country House, which is, to me, one of the better songs on The Great Escape, one of my highlights. You're pitting it against Roll With It, which I think is just a poor selection for a single from What's the Story, Morning Glory. It's not one of the more memorable tracks.
Right.
I think it makes sense for Country House to win. But then you're also taking what historically I think is one of Blur's, while it's still good, one of their weaker albums, and pitting it against Oasis's best album.
Best album.
Like, historically best. So it's an odd pairing of song selections from album selections out of the discography. But you know what? That's the way history lined up. That's the way the timeline worked. And what happened is, as much as critics initially really loved The Great Escape, in light of Oasis's success, and also Oasis was able to do what Blur had not done yet, and that's achieve acclaim in the US and popularity here. A lot of people kind of turned on Blur, and as much as they were the coolest guys one day, the next day they were kind of looked at as idiots because people saw Oasis as this everyman band, this working class band, and they saw Blur as this kind of like middle class, inauthentic group that they didn't want to get behind anymore, which I think is real shitty because at that point it's not about the music anymore.
Right. Now, we'll cover the rest of Blur's discography in part 2 of our Blur Artist Deep Dive podcast, self-titled Through 2015's The Magic Whip. But before we leave you today, please let us know. Send us a Facebook message or email or something. Let us know what your favorite early Blur album was. A lot of you guys over the last few years, honestly, have requested Tom and I to cover some of these Blur albums in depth. So here we are today. It's kind of perfect time because I've been wanting to really dive into Blur for a while. And I'm really curious, like out there now, so many years removed, who prefers Parklife or Modern Life or The Great Escape. And I'm interested. I mean, I have some theories, but I really want to vet these things.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what your guys' thoughts are. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation with Velocities in Music. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So, as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.